Hello everyone, welcome to Special Conversations. My name is Laura Sims and I'm the host. And I'm so excited to have Anne Fernald with us today, South Orange resident and modernist scholar extraordinaire. And she'll be speaking tonight as part of our Women's History Month celebration about 8 modernist women writers who navigated the limitations of their times to live extraordinary lives. For those of you who don't already know the fabulous Anne Fernald, I will tell you a little bit about her. She is Professor of English and Women's Studies at Fordham University, where she currently serves as Special Advisor to the Provost for Faculty Development. At Fordham, she served 3 years as the inaugural co-chair of the university's Council on Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion. She was born and raised in Seattle, Washington. I always forget that. She was educated. Yeah, she was educated at Wellesley and Yale. A scholar of modernism, especially Virginia Woolf, she edited Mrs. Dalloway for Cambridge University Press, and is the editor of the Norton Critical Edition of Mrs. Dalloway, as well as the Oxford Handbook of Virginia Woolf. She's also the author of a book on Woolf, Virginia Woolf, Feminism, and the Reader, as well as articles and reviews on Woolf and feminist modernism. She currently serves as co-editor of the quarterly journal Modernism Modernity, the flagship academic journal in the field. She's also an editor of the Norton Reader, an anthology of essays widely used in college and AP high school writing classes. As I said, she lives here in South Orange with her family, and we're so glad to have you here with us.
So I'm going to stand and I'm going to read for the first little bit of this because I tend to be a little digressive and I want to keep to script without getting, and then when I have to change the slide, I have to pop over here, and then, so it's going to be a little bit, so it'll be lively. So this will be, maybe half an hour of talking, and then we'll open it, and then Laura will ask me some questions, and then we'll open it up to Q&A for you. So thank you, Laura, so much. Thank you to the South Orange Public Library. And thanks to all of you for coming. It really means a lot to me that you showed up, and thanks for caring about women's history. So my talk today is an overview of my book in progress. So let me just switch the slide because why not? I feel like it. So this is kind of the epigraph to the whole project. Centuries ago, there was really only one expected narrative for most women's lives: marriage and family. Deviation from that script was unusual enough to be remarkable in life and in novels, and even remarkable women become wives at the end of the story. Jane Eyre ends with, "Reader, I married him." Gifted, unusual, and rebellious women blazed out in every community, but by and large, a woman's world was smaller and more constrained than a man's. Whether or not they saw it as unfair, most women expected less of whatever resources their families had than their brothers: monies, education, and time. Having the time to choose how to match your talents with what the world needs and choose your path accordingly has always been a privilege. However, until about a century ago, that privilege was almost exclusively the province of men. Men chose between a trade, university, the church, and the military. Men wondered if they had the talent to be an architect or if they should stick to the security of a union job as a builder. They deferred marriage to get their careers on track or chose to remain unmarried altogether. Historically, women have not had the time, space, or resources to develop their abilities, to make choices, or to change their minds. Even just 100 years ago, women born into economically secure families, what Virginia Woolf called the daughters of educated men, were often expected to become little more than wives. 100 years ago, however, the ground was beginning to shift. During the 19th century, women's colleges were founded, professions open to women, right to vote happened for women, birth control starts to exist, women start to recognize that not every woman is straight. So things start to open up, right? So that is the context in which I'm understanding this project is there are these past constraints that change 100 years ago, and there are women who were born around 100 years ago who have the possibility of choosing a life very different from the ones that their mothers had. And there really isn't a path for them, and they have to think about what it is I'm going to do. So that's the past constraints, and then I think about my current students. My students really are the inspiration for this project, and there are two little anecdotes I want to share with you about that. One is about 20 years ago when I was just beginning teaching modernist women writers. I was teaching in a little college in rural Indiana, and I was teaching Great Expectations, Charles Dickens's novel, and I said to my students, this is a survey of British literature from 1800 to the present. We're reading Great Expectations as part of that survey. One of the themes that interests me is kind of women in this course, but Great Expectations is not a book that I want you to think about for the women. The women in Great Expectations, not the most interesting part of the book, right? So I actually think that you should just put your interest in women on hold for that novel, right? Because the women are kind of cookie cutters, right? Great Expectations is a great book. It's interesting for lots of other things, not so much for the women. My students are like, oh, what do you mean, Professor? And I'm like, well, the women are just waiting. Like, both Miss Havisham and Estella just kind of spend the book waiting. And if you wait for your life to happen, you're not taking agency in your life. And you are an agent. And if you're just like Sleeping Beauty waiting to be kissed by the prince, what's your point? And a couple of the girls in the room were like, oh, what? And I was like, yeah, so maybe you should take agency in your life. And I saw a couple, to their credit, I was teaching to a room of 35 women, mostly blonde, mostly beloved and cherished, upper middle class, Midwestern young women. And I said, if you're imagining yourself as a Disney princess waiting for your prince to come and start your story, or end it, right? You're not taking enough control of the story that you're living in. And these young women were like, wait a minute. I was like, okay, so maybe think about your own agency in your life, right? That would be a good thing to do. I mean, they were all of a sudden, they're like, oh, Professor, that's actually a good idea. Maybe I should do that. I'm like, well, it's good we're thinking about this at 19, right? So I thought, wow, people aren't hearing this story enough, right? The ways in which we cherish, especially like middle-class, college-bound daughters, is sometimes to cherish them into a place where they don't even get to imagine themselves as having agency. Someday your prince will come, right? Maybe let's think a little harder about what your life is going to be. But then just the other week at Fordham, I was talking to a student about what she wanted to do with her career. And she was kind of, well, I think I'm probably going to take the LSAT. And then we'll go to law school. And I was like, why is she so depressed about this? Like, this is gonna be really hard. Like, becoming a lawyer is a really hard path. It's not easy. And it's a path that parents approve of often, but it's not simple. And I said, didn't you tell me that your dream was to be a television writer and to be in a writer's room for television? And weren't you studying acting and then you switched to screenwriting? Yes, all of this is true. So I said, well, how do you get to work in a writer's room for TV? She said, I don't know. I'm like, well, why don't you see if you can figure it out? And she's like, do you think I could do it? I'm like, yeah, well, how would I do that, Professor? I'm like, well, call some people. Here's someone I know, here's someone I know who knows how to do that. Figure out how to do that. And all of a sudden she's like, right. And you could see like how she had narrowed the horizons of her life before her life had even begun. And that's the thing that is constantly compelling me to tell these stories about women 100 years ago, is that ways in which we think about the stories that we tell us about what's possible for women and how we narrow or expand the horizons of our existence. So I've spent my adult life studying and teaching Virginia Woolf's work. I have no intention of stopping that project. And yet I'm consistently haunted by my friend and colleague Jane Garrity's remark that Virginia Woolf remains the only canonical woman writer of the period. Those of us who love Virginia Woolf can't stop talking about her. Those who are reluctant to let a woman writer into their club will often admit Woolf and then close the door behind her. I've also thought a lot about how to use my decades as a Woolf scholar in the service of drawing attention to other writers, rather than simply in the service of perpetuating the Woolf machine. Woolf tends to suck all the air out of the room. She commands attention. My hope in this project is that I can use Woolf's charisma, genius, and fame to draw your attention to others. So if we're moving outward from Woolf, the first obvious connection would be to the Bloomsbury group and women writers in her orbit. But others have written that book often, and really well. Moreover, the problem with making Woolf the nucleus of the set is that you too easily end up with a group of brilliant, culturally privileged, London-based, white British women, each of whom is not quite as good as Woolf, doing a project that's a lot like Woolf's project. So I abandoned the most obvious route and I kept thinking. The best-known women writers of the early 20th century, Virginia Woolf, Gertrude Stein, Zora Neale Hurston, were geniuses. They struggled and suffered, to be sure, but their talent was going to blaze out despite the obstacles they faced. And I found that their stories didn't really touch the questions that my friends and my students had to brave when they thought about how to do their lives, right? I mean, oh, be like Gertrude Stein. Well, no one is like, the only person like Gertrude Stein is Gertrude Stein, right? Oh, be like Zora Neale Hurston. Well, no, you can't, right? I mean, Zora Neale Hurston is incredible, and her writing is beautiful and amazing, and she was incredibly brave, but it's not a model for other people's lives in the way that these 8 women offer us some ideas about how we might approach our lives. We could look at the middlebrow and popular women writers, such as those republished in the UK by Persephone Books or Edna Ferber and Pearl Buck, who had major bestsellers in this period. We could look at radical women like Emma Goldman, Rosa Luxemburg, Tess Schlesinger, and Tilly Olsen, whose political commitment to social change drove and inspired their life's work. We could look at divas, iconoclasts, and free spirits like Nancy Cunard, Edmund St. Vincent Millay, and Amy Lowell. We could look at some of the conservative women once republished by Virago, such as Mary Butts and Olive Moore, or failures and people who write about failure, such as Jean Rhys and Juna Barnes, or writers who've been almost entirely forgotten, such as Marita Bonner and Gertrude Trevelyan. We're not lacking in options for women writers in this period. I mean, it would be really easy to make a set. But when I thought about the women's writers whose stories made me the most consistently curious, it was those women who were a notch less brave than the geniuses and divas, women who worried about how their talent and ambition might upset their family members. The stories at the heart of this book project that I'm in the middle of are women writers who, late into adolescence, even into adulthood, show every sign of obeying a rather ordinary social script, and then their lives take a turn. They change jobs, take a leap into political activism, commit to earning a living, leave a male lover for a woman. What combination of social change, family context, and personal bravery made such change possible? I was more interested in mainstream women than radicals. I rejected some interesting choices because their work was racist or anti-Semitic. I didn't feel like I needed to give a megaphone to people who were spouting those ideas. The 8 women profiled here, and you see them on the screen, are diverse by design. The book brings together black, white, and Asian women, lesbian, queer, and straight. Some were mothers and others not, from the United States, England, Jamaica, and China, all of whom shared the impulse in life and in art to seize possibilities for change. And I'll tell you, just because in case it's driving you crazy, you don't know who these women are, right? So we're going to move from top to bottom, left to right as I go through. So we have Eileen Chang and Margaret Wise Brown, Jessie Fauset and Sylvia Townsend Warner, Vera Brittain, Muriel Rukeyser, Una Marson, and Dorothy Arzner. I think I talked about Dorothy Arzner before Marson, but the layout of the slide wasn't my friend because of the horizontal and vertical, so I hope you forgive me. So, as I said, the way that you live your life depends on the kind of story you imagine yourself to be telling. And my sense of how we imagine those stories, of where the horizon of our imagination stands, is at the heart of my life as a teacher and a scholar. So Their Eyes Were Watching God opens with a meditation, that's Hurston's novel, on how the horizon differs for women and men. She writes, "Ships at a distance have every man's wish on board. For some, they come in with the tide. For others, they sail from on the horizon, never out of sight, never landing, until the watcher turns his eyes away in resignation, his dreams mocked to death by time. That is the life of men." Now women forget all those things they don't want to remember and remember everything they don't want to forget. The dream is the truth. They act. So Hurston's notion of the horizon is connected, I think, with the work of the contemporary feminist theorist Sarah Ahmed, who also talks about the horizons. And she has a book called The Promise of Happiness. And in The Promise of Happiness, she writes about the trap of happiness, especially for women. And she notes how often assumptions about what makes a woman happy align with ideas of what a woman should be. Think of how automatically we say, "You must be so happy," when a woman hits a conventional milestone, such as an engagement, a marriage, or motherhood. Do we mean happy on these occasions, or are we defining happy as a relief that someone's coloring in the lines, right? "Oh, you must be so happy. Thank goodness you're not doing something weird, right? I don't have to think about you anymore." Ahmed contrasts philosophical debates about human flourishing and the good life, from Plato down to the present, with feminist critiques from Virginia Woolf, Betty Friedan, and others, of the ways that a social script for a woman's so-called happiness ends up being about obedience, compliance, and sweetness. In The Promise of Happiness, Ahmed sketches out 3 types of women who resist falling into the conventional marriage plot: feminist killjoys, unhappy queers, and melancholic migrants. Pretty good, right? I know, she's the best. So she's on Twitter as @feministkilljoy. It's great. It's brilliant. I'm so indebted to it. At the same time, I'm totally not a killjoy. I'm constitutionally incapable of remaining a killjoy for too long. So rather than emphasize the obstacles women face and celebrate those who call our attention to them, which is kind of Ahmed's project, my focus is on 4 strategies for making a change when change still feels hard. Strategies for hope and possibility. I hope and expect that they'll be inspiring and help us think through how, even in a constrained life, new things become possible. I've organized this project in 4 pairs of women, each pair representing a strategy for building a new kind of life. A life that has exciting new possibilities in it, but remains bound by social constraint. For the time that remains to me today, I want to share with you a little more about these 4 strategies and the 8 women exemplars. So we'll see how we do. We're going to be fine. So, wanderers, ladies, rebels, and pioneers, and each one represents a distinct response to the revolutionary changes of the times. Wanderers sought the right to be a little indecisive, to wait to find their path without becoming prey to someone else's plan. Ladies sought to make daring choices without losing face or breaking ties. Rebels spoke out directly against injustice. And pioneers forged paths for themselves that later closed to other women. So let's start with the wanderers. I have a soft spot for these wanderers. In A Room of One's Own, Woolf outlines how connected these things all are. Our ability to be creative depends on material conditions: money, space, time, and the freedom to wander. The women wanderers in this section, Eileen Chang and Margaret Wise Brown, explore the power of exploration itself. They travel, they daydream, they wonder if life might be otherwise. At the same time, wanderers encounter barriers, hard challenges to their own desires, obstacles that force them, their characters, and us to consider who gets the right to wander. Both of these women demonstrate how quickly the world is ready to swoop in and steer a wanderer onto an expected path. In her most famous short story, Sealed Off, Eileen, a young teacher, sits grading papers on a tram in wartime Shanghai. The tram is stopped by some unspecified war action, and the teacher's trapped, suspended between work and home, thinking, at home she was a good daughter, at school she was a good student. In this flat account, we hear how she yearns for more. And moments later, a guy sits down next to her. He's a young husband, he's a real louche. He's trying to avoid talking to some other dude on the tram, and so he starts flirting with her. But it completely discombobulates her. So she's thinking, maybe I want something more, and this flirtation disorients her, and she thinks, well, maybe I should have an affair with a married man. He puts it in her head, and he's not even interested in her. He's just flirting to avoid talking to some dude that he doesn't like. Ugh. When Margaret Wise Brown was going to switch, the Chang ones are hard, right? Because, you know, if you wander, they come in and stomp on you. When Margaret Wise Brown graduated from college, she didn't know what she wanted to do. She enrolled in classes at Bank Street, and she was a flop as a preschool teacher, just terrible. Like, she's written up for spilling the glue, leaving the art room a mess. But she turned out to be a really gifted writer, and she figured out how to do something that Bank Street really needed, to write short, engaging books in the here and now style of the school. No hidden Christian moralizing, no fairies and princesses, just stories about puppies and traffic lights, mail deliveries, bowls of mush. And because Brown's father subsidized these years of desultory wandering, she came into her own at last, inventing a career that hadn't existed before she started writing. Writing books for people who don't know how to read. Like, that's a weird kind of writing job, right? To be a writer for people where your text is only ever going to be read to you. That didn't exist before Margaret Wise Brown started doing Goodnight Moon and Sailor Dog. And if you look at those books, one of the things that's so remarkable about them, even though a lot of if her characters have genders, they're often boys, but they're not masculine macho boys who are conforming to 40s and 50s gender roles. They are just humans who are kind of slightly gendered as boy, right? And you think about how Brown invites children to think beyond their own horizons. When the little dog in Sailor Dog is shipwrecked, he makes himself a shelter on the beach. Before he remembers his goal, and then he remembers, as he's got this little shelter, that actually the whole thing he wanted to do was to wander. If he could build a house, he could mend a hole in his ship, and then he's off again on his travels. So, while some young women wander, others thoroughly assume the mantle of young ladyhood, presenting a public face of calm, honorable respectability, and in that, well into adulthood, find not only comfort but protection. The two writers whom I call ladies, Sylvia Townsend Warner and Jessie Redmond Fauset, live lives designed to avoid public scandal. When Jessie Fauset graduated valedictorian from her prestigious Philadelphia High School for Girls, she expected to go to Bryn Mawr, as every other valedictorian had. However, M. Carey Thomas, the charismatic and racist president of the college, intervened to prevent her matriculation. No black women in Bryn Mawr. So she went to Cornell. She was probably the first black woman to earn the honor of Phi Beta Kappa there, and while she was at Cornell, she wrote a letter to W.E.B. Du Bois and said, I really admire what you're doing, can you help me get a job? And he got her a position teaching in summer, and she became the literary editor of The Crisis from 1919 to 1924. The Crisis is the organ of the NAACP. Her tenure there is unparalleled for her discovery and promotion of some of the greatest African-American writers of the 20th century, including Gwendolyn Bennett, Marita Bonner, Arna Bontemps, Conti Cullen, Langston Hughes, Zora Hurston, James Weldon Johnson, Claude McKay, Effie Lee Newsome, Jean Toomer, and Walter White. Wow. In that role at The Crisis, she worked closely with Du Bois, managing his correspondence, writing speeches and editorials for him, and traveling with him to several Pan-African conferences. Fauset is often dismissed as bowing to respectability politics and seen as tame. But her journalism and letters to the editor, both before she wrote novels and after, in letters to the editor of the Montclair News, she lived in Montclair from 1939 to 1960, she expressed her anger and frustration at the idiocy of white journalists making pronouncements about the race. In her novels, and she wrote 4 novels, it's the most of any novelist of the Harlem Renaissance, she transmuted her rage into dignity, writing aspirational stories of young black people who know they have the talent and potential of any other American at a time when few white people, including her publishers, perceive blacks as equal in humanity, perceive black people as equal in humanity. She's just amazing. So she has novels, most of her novels have the kind of theme of race passing. They're about the Du Boisian talented 10th. So her characters are all college educated professionals. They fall in love with each other, but they have, you know, they are racially profiled in restaurants and on the road. It's not a simple path, but they're beautiful fantasies of and accounts of the black middle class in the 20s. And she's much less well known than she should be. Sylvia Townsend Warner, another lady, had almost no formal schooling and no university education. But in her 20s and 30s, she worked as a musicologist, and she was one of the editors, the only woman and the only so-called amateur, of the massive 10-volume Tudor church music. And she is the person who figured out the way that they wrote music in the Elizabethan era is different from the way we know music now. And she figured out how to translate it into contemporary annotation. So if you look at if you go to an early, I'm trying not to look at the music journalists in the room because I might be wrong, but I think I'm right. If you go to a performance of Elizabethan music, the way that we know how to read that has to do with the research that she did. She was going to study with Schoenberg in Germany in Austria in 1914, but obviously that was stopped. So she had to repivot. So she began writing. She carried on a desultory affair with a married man, and then in 1930 she fell in love with a woman. And she's like, oh, that's different. They began a marriage kind of before the letter, right? They began a partnership that would last until Valentine Acklin, her partner's death. 5 years later, both women joined the Communist Party. And the following year, Warner's fourth novel, Summer Will Show, was published. And that fall, she and her partner went to Spain in support of the Republican side on the Spanish Civil War. And they returned less than a year later as delegates to the International Writers' Congress. This is a big change. And in some ways, the cardigans and the cats permitted it, right? She was so polite that being a kind of, everyone knew she was a lesbian, everyone knew she and Valentine were in a partnership, and partly because she looked so normal, to use a word, right, conventional, people were like, yeah, that's Sylvia. Hi Sylvia, nice to see you. Rebels. Rebels takes its inspiration from the idea that sometimes a young woman witnesses an injustice so staggering that it shakes her loose from social convention. In her memoir of her service as a volunteer nurse, Vera Brittain goes into great detail to describe her pretty clothes on leave and her frustration at not being able to keep clean in the mud in France. She was, in short, a conventional girl in many ways, but her parents' deep reluctance to send her to university set her at odds with her father. She fought him for several years, first to go to college, and then he relented in August of 1914, and whoops, she can't go to college. So she encouraged her brother to enlist and volunteer as a nurse and to get posted. She encouraged her brother to enlist, then she fought with her father to volunteer, then she fought with her father to get posted to France, rather than nursing in London, where the less ailing men were kept. The senseless violence she witnessed in France led her to a lifelong commitment to pacifism. At last, having lost her brother, her fiancé, and two of her closest male friends, she put the losses together with the experience of nursing wounded Germans and dedicated the remainder of her life to peace work. As a college student, the poet Muriel Rukeyser traveled to Scottsboro, Alabama, to witness the trial of black men her age falsely accused of sexual assault, which set her on a path of writing and witness that continued to the Spanish Civil War, the opening days of which she witnessed, and the Vietnam War. The experience of witnessing the opening days of the Spanish Civil War shaped her sense of war, violence, and the poet's role when conflict arises. In 1936, she was only 22 and already a leftist. She went to Europe on a fellowship to go to some anti-fascist conference, and she just ditched her fellowship and went to Barcelona because she heard that there was going to be a People's Olympiad. That People's Olympiad never happened because the war broke out. As a witness during those first days of violence, Rukeyser committed to leftist politics and had a brief affair with the anti-fascist German athlete Otto Bach. who becomes Hans in her novel Savage Coast. It's a very sexy novel. And he unfortunately died in the fighting in 1939. But Werkheiser's account of her commitment to poetry as a form of resistance becomes the kind of hallmark of her career for the rest of her life. So finally, pioneers. Oh, Dorothy Arzner, I just love her. She's so fabulous. Dorothy Arzner and Una Marson were new media pioneers, and they were but two of many such women in their time. Arzner was the first woman to join the Screen Directors Guild, now the Directors Guild of America, in 1938, just 2 years after its founding. She was the first woman in the United States to direct a sound film. She invented the boom microphone, and she was known for working with and championing the work of women in film, including directing Katharine Hepburn in her first starring role. In Arzner's 1940 movie, Dance Girl Dance, which you can find on Amazon Prime, Lucille Ball and Maureen O'Hara played rival dancers in a traveling troupe. Bubbles has oomph and loves burlesque, that's Lucille Ball, but Judy dreams of being a real artist, a modern dancer in the style of Martha Graham or George Balanchine. They find success on Broadway in a show where Judy is the stooge, her dance the punchline for a rowdy audience, impatient for Bubbles' comedy and striptease. They boo Judy off the stage every night until one night she cracks and lectures the audience, breaking the fourth wall of the theater and the film. This leads to Judy's big break, a job with the head of her dream dance company, the leaders of which have just happened to be in the audience that night. In the most extensive interview of her career, Arzner downplayed her professional relationship to other women, but her career includes multiple examples of feminist solidarity behind the scenes. Una Marson was the first black woman to start a magazine in Jamaica, the first black woman host of a BBC radio show, the first Jamaican to appear on television in a limited broadcast at an exhibition, the first black person to mount a play in the West End in London. When she worked on her second play, London Calling, with fellow Jamaican Louise Bennett, Bennett was the first black student at the Royal Academy of Dramatic Arts and a BBC radio host in her own right. In London, Marson roomed with other black writers and political activists and worked alongside white feminist activists, including Winifred Holtby and Vera Brittain. All of which is to say that the title of first, for all its importance, can obscure networks and community that stand behind it. Lonely as it may have been to be a pioneer, these women were not without peers and networks. At a time when women were asked to hang back, to shun attention, Arzner and Marson had big, visible careers, and their work dramatized the allure and the costs of being a public woman. Furthermore, both were extraordinarily successful professionals who could not and did not hide the fact that neither was a straight white woman. So, what's my argument? In some ways it's pointing at things and saying, look how cool these 8 women are. I mean, that's kind of most of it, right? Here are some books for you to read next. But like any good museum exhibition, it's more than just a collection of things on the wall. It's curated from a bigger set, and that's what I was trying to say in my opening, right? I chose this set to tell a neglected story of the moment of modernism, about 100 years ago. When we tell the story of the revolutionary changes in art a century ago, those wrought by Pablo Picasso, Martha Graham, Duke Ellington, and Virginia Woolf, we think about artists who broke the old forms and made them new. What I want to propose is that one of the most radical acts of making it new is choosing to take control of your life. Choosing the story that you understand yourself to be in and giving your life a shape that you and your parents hadn't imagined for you. 100 years ago, some women had some of the choices that many men have always had. Do I stay in my hometown? Do I go to college? What career should I pursue? Who am I and how will I share my talents with the world? In this project, I want to show how hard many women wrestled with these choices, how they coped with the inevitable setbacks and disappointments, how they used their art to imagine otherwise. And in sharing 4 strategies, wanderers, ladies, rebels, and pioneers, I want to impress on you that there's more than one way to do it. Overall, this is my last paragraph. Overall, this project is about the courage of ordinary women. Woolf said of a room of one's own, I wanted to encourage the young women. They seem to get fearfully depressed. This project, too, means to encourage women through telling the stories of other women's uneven individual experiences of huge social and cultural transformations. Stories help us understand our choices, our ability to change, even within often crushing contingencies of our lives. We tell young people you can be whatever you want to be, but again and again we see how conditioning limits choices, how circumstances narrow opportunities. This is particularly true for anyone born outside the very innermost circles of power. This project looks at the literature these women wrote and how it uncovers their own stories and ours. Through their writing, I hope we can see how their choices were shaped by the social revolutions of a century ago, the people in their lives, their own talents, needs, and desires. It's my hope that these stories help expand our sense of the possible. Thank you. So we have time for questions, but oh, look at those nice ladies, I love them. All right, I want to get back to the pretty slide with everybody. Have our questions. So Laura's going to ask me some questions and then she'll open it up. But that's the one, I think, right? That's the one.
Thank you so
My
much,
friends.
Anne. Yeah, this is cool. Yeah, I was going to ask you how you chose, like, how did you
So I started
choose these?
this class, teaching a class
Okay.
over 20 years ago in rural Indiana. And it was a modernist women writers class.
Okay.
And it was 6 women, and it was the most famous women that you can imagine, right? And then I've been teaching this class for over 20 years, and I keep refining the set. And then about maybe 10 years ago, I was talking to a friend, and she said, they're just some of these women I'm just not interested in them. They're great. Some of them are better writers than these women. Like, you know, their writing is more beautiful or they're more famous. I'm less interested in them. And she sat with me and we had a beer and we made the list, like who's Anne interested in, who's she not interested in. And I realized that, like, I like this wrestling with, like, I thought my life was going to go this way and I wanted to go a different way. And so then I kept refining and refining and refining that. Then in 2013, I edited a special issue of a journal on modernist women writers.
Yeah.
And so we had 8 articles in that issue. And an article came in on Muriel Rukeyser's novel, which was rejected. She was in Spain in 1936. She witnessed the opening of the Spanish Civil War. She wrote this really sexy, very experimental, very powerful leftist novel that's completely autobiographical. It's one of those documents that only 22-year-olds write. Just like in a fever of 6 weeks, just writes this long, long novel about an American Jewish poet who goes to the People's Olympics and has an affair with a German anti-fascist hunky athlete, which is what happened to Muriel Rukeyser. And you know, and she sends it out to be published, and the publishers all say, no, this is not. And it sat in the archive until my friend and colleague Rowena Kennedy Epstein found it. And everyone had seen it, but everyone who's interested in Muriel Rukeyser is interested in poetry. Mm-hmm. And so they see the novel, and they're like, well, that's a novel, I'm not gonna do that. And Rowena was like, oh, it's a novel, that's interesting. And then she found all the rejection letters, like, you know, this character has sex, we can't have that. Well, it's like, well, you know, it happens to some of us, right? And so some of us do have sex. And so, you know, and sometimes that happens in a novel, you know, and so Rowena brought the book out, and her intro came into the journal. And then there was an article about Dorothy Arzner, so I learned about those two from that. Okay. So anyway.
Wow. So you kind of patch them together.
Yeah,
and
so it just kind of iterates.
Yeah. And how far along is the book?
It's about halfway written. It's a mess. But, you know, I have a sabbatical next year, so that's
good.
So
you
that's
knock it out.
We're gonna knock it out.
Nice.
That's right. We'll be done. We'll be done in a year from now. It'll be a book party time. Not exactly.
Yes.
But no. Maybe 2 years.
And does each woman have her own chapter, or is it?
Each woman has her own chapter. The way I'm thinking about it now is I'm thinking like I'm going to say this with a combination of great hubris and humility, I hope, right? And so I'm imagining like Virginia Woolf is my Virgil. Like imagine I'm Dante guiding you through the world of this. And Virginia Woolf will kind of help us, lead us through, because she has smart things to say about all of these issues that these women face. And I'm hoping that my experience as a Woolf scholar and my knowledge of Woolf, like I dropped a lot of the Woolf quotes today because they get a little heavy hearing, right?
Yeah.
But I think that that'll help carry you through as a reader when you're like, wait, who's this Eileen Chang? I've never heard of her before. But oh, here's a theme that Virginia Woolf touches on that is important in Eileen Chang's fiction.
Yeah. Oh, that's cool.
That's the idea.
Right. And do your students respond to these?
All these 8 writers teach fantastically.
Yeah.
So if there was a writer that didn't teach well, she's out, right? I mean, so you know, traditional age students at Fordham like her, and they're all women who have lives that, I mean, I don't know how you all feel, but when I go home and talk to my friends who are my age or my mother's age, and I say, did you know about Eileen Chang? And I say, tell me about her, and I start telling them, so they're like, that's really interesting, why hadn't I heard of her? So, right, so they had to pass that test of like people leaning forward in their seat about both the lives and like what they wrote, right? Like with Sylvia Townsend Warner, it's so cool, like she falls in love with a woman and then she writes this kind of saucy lesbian novel about the 1848 revolution in Paris that ends with the heroine getting handed a bootleg manuscript copy of the Communist Manifesto. so and it's like, yes, you know, and so it's like, wow, you know, she started out just doing like musicology, and now all of a sudden she's like on the barricades. It's cool.
And that is, which one is that?
That's Sylvia Townsend Warner.
But which novel?
Summer Will Show.
Summer Will Show, okay. Yes.
So I'm a librarian, and I was at some conference, and they had a copy of Leonard Marcus's
Biography of Margaret Wise Brown.
And I thought, oh well, yeah, let me read it, and I was blown away by her life. I mean, it is just fascinating, and every time I try to suggest it to somebody, they're like, well, of course you like it because you're a librarian, and you know, she wrote, and I'm like, no, this is a woman who was like a bohemian. She was in the West Village during the 20s and hung out with all these people, and
it's like on the train to go see Gertrude Stein's opera in Hartford, to see Four Saints and Three Acts. We had an all-black cast, right? And she's like, this is the best opera ever. And that's why her writing is so cool, is that she was into Stein. You know, so yeah, sorry, but...
No, it's just that people have, you know, a set notion about somebody and think, you know, well, it just could be about the woman who wrote Good Night Moon, and I'm like, her life is so
Nice
bigger
little
than that.
children's book author, right?
Yeah,
right.
it read like a novel, her life.
Oh, it's like a novel,
Yeah.
her life.
Anyway, so
Yeah.
I guess what I'm
Is
doing
it here in the
saying,
library?
please,
Do we,
The
can we
Leonard
put,
Marcus?
yeah, can we
read it.
well, can we
Is
get it in the,
here,
can
Beth?
you think we can get it here?
Probably, yeah,
Yeah.
We'll go upstairs.
yeah.
And that biography is very, very restrained about her sexuality.
Yeah.
Right? She had a long love affair with Michael Strange, who was born Blanche Ulrich, who Michael Strange used to be married to a Barrymore, and then she divorced, and she and Margaret Wise Brown had this very tumultuous, kind of abusive love affair where Ulrich was really quite cruel to Margaret Wise Brown and told her she wasn't a real writer, what she did didn't count. And Michael Strange used to tour around to these kind of women who was really magnificent. And she'd tour around and she'd do this program called An Evening with Michael Strange. And it would be reciting the poetry of Shakespeare, Keats, Wordsworth, and Michael Strange.
That sounds very contemporary.
Tonight it's so packed.
Oh my gosh. How did you come up with the categories? Wanderers, ladies, rebels, pioneers.
So I wanted, teaching it really works well to pair people when you're teaching. And I really wanted to make pairs that were not along national or racial lines, right? And I really wanted to just shake up our sense of how we make the set. And, you know, I mean, Emma had a big laugh for Sarah Ahmed's categories. My categories are a little more, blah. So I'm not totally married to the names. Like my father says, they're all pioneers. Like pioneers doesn't make sense as a category, right? But I can't think of a better name for these two. I used to call them new media pioneers, but I find that a tiresome phrase. So that's not right, even though it is radio and film. So anyway, you can help me with that, but that, it's really more the pairing that helped me. And then thinking about strategies of addressing the change. So I'm really interested with Chang and Brown about the right to wander, the right not to know what you want to do, and how many resources you have to have, and how important that is for so many people, and how expensive it is, and how valuable it is. And Chang didn't get what she needed from that, and her life was really hurt by the tumultuous political environment in China, but she really would have benefited from having kind of the paternal paycheck that Margaret Wise Brown had, you know. And so, but they both really write beautifully about how when you're 21, you're not done. And it's okay not to be done. And actually, you know, there's more to learn. And, you know, so that seemed really important to me.
Right.
Yeah, David.
And when you're teaching this course, what kind of assignments do you give your students?
So, you know, that ranges the whole gamut. And so I always like them to write something pretty formal and strict, because some of them want to go on to law school and they need to be able to construct an argument and base that argument in the text. But I also always invite them to write personal narratives, right? And so they can, you know, this reminds me of the struggle my mother went through, right? And they can write that essay, because that becomes really important, because I really want them to make that connection between the things these women are going through and the kinds of choices they're making in their lives. So there's always that invitation. They're always invited to, there's always a final project. They can redesign the book covers. I mean, sometimes we talk about how these women, I mean, it's so fun to work on 20th century women because we have photographs of all of them, right? And so sometimes they'll get inspired and want to draw something, right? I used to be snobby about that and feel like, well, that's not an intellectual thing. But actually now I think that time spent doing something creative where you're actually thinking about Muriel Rukeyser and where the line goes and how to do that actually is an important meditative practice in imagining what is it that I am drawn to, right? And what is it I'm drawn to in her? Right, what makes me interested in her? So they can do whatever they want. One of the things I've been doing a lot lately that's been really fun, as a kind of interim assignment, is put students in groups of 3 or 4 based on what they're interested in and have them make a podcast. And they record a podcast together and they have a conversation. And they have to come in with some questions and have done some research, and they talk to each other, and you see, it's more interesting for me to listen to than an oral report.
Right.
And you hear them listening to each other and learning from each other.
That's cool.
That's great.
Yeah.
Hey, at the end you talked about how you're trying to expand this idea of modernism, right? Like to include this idea of change. You touched a little bit with Margaret Wise Brown and Muriel Rukeyser in how their work was actually affected by modernism. Can you just talk about like how much they were affected by the experiments of modernism, if any of them were, in the actual writing?
So it's all over Margaret Wise Brown.
Right.
Her favorite writers are Virginia Woolf and Gertrude Stein. And if you think back, those of you who are parents who read Goodnight Moon to your children or who spent time with little babies, and you realize that that's like, her board books are some of the more tolerable ones. Like if your kid gets obsessed with a Margaret Wise Brown book, you're in pretty good shape. Or some of the other ones that they want you to read over and over again, you're like gonna die of boredom. Part of that is because she has this poetic, elliptical, fragmentary, very sensory, kind of imagist interest in describing the world we're in now. I know less about the Chinese modernism of the period, but I know that Eileen Chang's, so there's a huge revolution going on in literature in China in the 1920s, and Chang is participating in that. And it is in conversation with Baudelaire and Language of the Flaneuse and kind of what it means to be a cosmopolitan person. Chang's mother was college educated in England. Chang wanted to go to the UK to go to college, but again, these world wars have a way of foiling her plans. Una Marson is a really interesting case because her poetry is much more traditional, and in that you see the effects of colonial education. Right, so the poetry that she was learning in Jamaica was Wordsworth. And so she writes very accessible, short ballads that look like lyrical ballads, look like Wordsworthian lyrical ballads, but they're about what it's like to be a black person in London at a time when, I mean, she's in London before the Windrush, so as you probably know, it's only after World War II that Britain has a substantive non-white population, right? But she's there in the 30s and 40s when she's often the only black person in a room, right? And so she's writing about that experience, even as she's working at the BBC with with African, Indian, and white correspondents from all over the empire. So she certainly had a cosmopolitan work environment, but walking home, no. I could go on, but, Fauset is so cruelly served in 1924 when Plum Bun comes out. At a huge literary dinner, they have a big party for her, and the men get up, and Opportunity had just started as a magazine that was a rival to The Crisis. And the editor of Opportunity gets up and says, what we need now is a new generation. And in 1924, Fauset was 42. And they start talking about all the writers that Fauset has discovered as really the true generation of the Harlem Renaissance. So the day her first novel is published, they're pushing her to the side as a middle-aged woman. And you read her letters, and she talks about the rage that she felt that she could not express. Because she's sitting there in a ballroom in Midtown with Carl Van Vechten, W.B. Du Bois, Booker T. Washington, everyone, right? It's written up in the Times as a party for her. And her novels, the literary style is not experimental, right? She's writing a straight up narrative. They look like, almost like romance novels, they're very heavily plotted. But what she's doing is, so interesting. She stages these conversations between young people. Should I work in the post office or should I become an artist? If I become an artist, I know that I'm going to be fighting racism my whole life. If I work in the post office, it's a good union job, but I won't get to follow my dream. Or government job, not a union job.
Right.
You know what I mean? It's a job that will be secure for the rest of my life.
Right.
Yeah, Chris.
I'm curious about Dorothy
Arzner?
Arzner, because what she did, as opposed to whether or not you like something that's writing, is so demonstrable. Like one of the early sound directors, as you said, invented the boom. But so much of the praise of the pioneering woman directors heaped on Ida Lupino,
Yes.
who directs 20 years later.
Right.
So why do you think she's forgotten and passed over?
There was a big Arzner revival, interestingly, in the 70s, at the end of Arzner's life. And she participated in it and loved it and was fed it. Arzner was pushed aside in the 40s. The last movie she directed is a really wonderful, very soapy, dramatic World War II movie with Merle Oberon called First Comes Courage. Have you seen it? So good, ends with a car chase. And at the end of it, like Merle Oberon, they're in Norway, and Merle Oberon is a double agent, and she's married to this Nazi, and they blow her Nazi husband up, and she goes to her British spy boyfriend, and he hugs her, and he says, "Great job, baby," and she says, "I'm going back in." And he's like, "No, you come back with me, like you did a great job, you're a girl, that's more than most girls do." And she's like, "No, I'm gonna go back in and keep fighting, now I can really be a great double agent because I'm the widow of a Nazi," right? and so she's like, "We gotta fight the Nazis." And so it's like one of those exciting World War II movies that's made in the middle of the war, so the people who are making the movie don't know how it's gonna go, right? But Arzner got pneumonia when that was being made, and she didn't finish it, and she only has partial directorial credit for that film. And there's a audio recording of an interview with her that I heard on a podcast recently. That's a part of her archive I haven't delved into fully, where she says, "No one will ever know what happened to me. I will never tell that story." And the rage in that description, because she was in her early 40s, and she never directed again. But she went on. And this is the great story. She went on to UCLA to teach film, and she was great at it. And her favorite student was.
Well, I know she had George Lucas
and Coppola.
Yeah.
Oh, no kidding.
And Coppola was seen as a really unpromising student, and she told the faculty that actually Francis was not bad, and you might not dismiss him as a director.
Wow.
And it's easy to find him heaping praise on her. He adored her. And there's some stuff in the archives of her, some teaching records, some essays she wrote. But it's hard to know why. I think her movies were dismissed as, it's hard for me to understand because her movies were dismissed as women's films. But the movie she made with Katharine Hepburn and Christopher Strong is about a pilot who has an affair with a married man. She gets pregnant, and he tells her, "You can't fly again." And can I spoil it for you? I mean, it's from the 30s, right? So I mean, I think that ship has sailed, right? And so he says, "You can't fly again," and she realizes that that's not okay with her. And she decides she's going to break the sound barrier or some sound record, and she flies up in the plane and commits suicide, basically. And takes her, like the last shot is her taking the mask off in the plane. And you see the dials going crazy like they do in those aviation movies, and that's the end, because she won't give up her love of flying. And that's Katharine Hepburn's first starring role. And that's Katharine Hepburn, right? I mean, Katharine Hepburn was like a bit player. She was going to be in a Tarzan movie. And Arzner saw her and said, "Come with me. I have a job for you." So people dismiss that as like a woman's film because you can see that as it's a sentimental movie about a pregnant woman who commits suicide. Or you can see that as Katharine Hepburn, pilot, right? I mean, that is wild. And the pictures of her with Joan Crawford, it's hard to know how many of these women she had affairs with. Hepburn is rumored for sure. The photographs of her with Crawford certainly look like two women having a very intimate love affair. She had a partner. There's some wonderful candids of Marlene Dietrich in her archives that look very intimate to me. Yeah. So, I don't know why. I think she's exciting. So, but you're right. Lupino has she gets the credit.
Yeah.
A lot.
Time for maybe one more question.
Sorry, I got excited.
I like these. I know.
Well, one more favorite of mine is I love Vera Brittain, and Testament of Youth is, I don't know.
Isn't it such a beautiful, so it's a
After I read that, I have some fixation on World War I and the period then, but after I read her memoir, I thought, now I really know what war is like and what World War I was like. It is heartbreaking, it is well written, it is
yeah, I
really
recommend
really
it.
worthwhile reading.
It's really worthwhile reading. It's quite long.
Yeah.
the minute the war ended, she knew she wanted to write this memoir. And it took her until 1934 to write it. And she writes about the trauma, and how long it took her to recognize the trauma. But she also writes about, she has this, she does something technically, those of you who are writers will appreciate, where she keeps talking about what she thought then and what she knows now. And so whether you're interested in her, how she became a pacifist, or in the technical thing of being a memoirist, she keeps saying, at the time I thought my patriotic duty was to go to war. Now I realize that I was being sold a load of hooey, right? And so she keeps saying, like, at the time we weren't allowed to do this, and I accepted my father's rule. She couldn't go on a date with her boyfriend without a chaperone. So all of her dates with her fiance had her aunt with her. And she talks about like how awful it is to be like on a date with her fiance during World War I. And there are 3 people at dinner. And her aunt is bored out of her. I mean, how boring, right, to be with 2 20-year-olds. And then they want to kiss. They want to kiss, and they kind of can't kiss. And the aunt is really like a chaperoning, like not doing the thing that you probably should do, which is like, I need to go run an errand, right, hang back. And then she talks about like, kissing the glove that her fiance had touched because he'd never touched her hand. And she says, girls of today, right, writing in 1934, like girls of today can't believe that was the world of my girlhood. But the war changed all of that, right? She wouldn't be seen in public without gloves.
Up to the 50s too.
Neither my grandma.
I just have a quick question.
Yeah, of course.
It would be lovely if, for each of these great women, that if we could get 1 or 2 books that are related, or films, or do we have to wait for your book to come?
You don't have to wait. So Eileen Chang has. So
I don't have pencil and paper. I'm not
chose-
good on my phone.
So I can tell you and see how well you remember, and then I don't know how to tell you another way. So Eileen Chang has, her books come out from the New York Review of Books. They're in print, you can get them on Amazon. I tried to choose people that are not impossible to find. Love in a Fallen City is a collection of short stories. That's probably the most famous one. That's the best one to start with. Margaret Wise Brown, I presume,
Yeah.
Goodnight Moon, right? I would say Plum Bun is the Fauset novel. Warner's first novel, Lolly Willows, is fantastic. It's so
What was
good.
it called again?
Lolly Willows, Lolly Willows. It's about a woman named Laura Willows. They call her Lolly, and they ask her to be their nanny. She never marries, and they move her to London, and she's the nanny for her brother's kids. And then her brother's kids grow up and get married and start having kids, and the child that she's raised is pregnant and says, "You're going to be the nanny for the next generation," and she's like, and she moves to the provinces and sells her soul to the devil and becomes a witch. It's amazing, right? She's just like, I'm out. It's so good, and it's so funny. It's short. Testament of Youth, Una Marson. The funniest, the most fun thing for Una Marson is to go on YouTube, and there's a wonderful World War II documentary, propaganda film, of her at the BBC in telling British people not to be racist. And she's in a dance hall with people from all over the Caribbean, black and white, dancing with each other, interracial dancing, all in uniform, and the voiceover is saying, "There are many guests here helping us fight the Germans, and this is what we're fighting for, and they're from all over the empire, and they may look unfamiliar to you, but they are here to help us, and you need to behave yourself." And she's the host, and she interviews like a cricketer, and a lumberjack, and an engineer, and it's very funny because she comes in and she's kind of got her clipboard and there's dance music playing, and there's this African American, there's this black British like jazz band playing, and then she kind of tells them to stop and looks at the clock and this is Una Marson for the BBC. So that's what I recommend for that. And then Dance Girl Dance is on Amazon. Her only novel is Savage Coast, and I love that. So there you go.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you, thank
That
you
was
so
too
much,
much.
Anne.
Thank
Thank you so much.
Thanks for coming.
That was
I really,
fabulous.
really
Yeah,
appreciate it.
Thank you all for coming. The next special conversation is Thursday, April 13th at 6 p.m. And we'll have a panel of 3 Montclair authors, really great authors, 2 novelists and a nonfiction writer, Marcy Dermansky,
Oh, Marcy.
Catherine Dykstra, and Lori Lico Albanese. And they're gonna be talking about and deconstructing the idea of the bad girl in fiction and nonfiction. So April 13th, and if you're interested in coming to more of these, I have a sign-up sheet that I'll put out. You can put your email. I only send 1 email a month with my programs that are coming up. We have some great programs coming this spring.
Thank you.
Thank you again.
Thanks,
Anne.
Laura.
Mhm.